Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really going to challenge how you might picture some dinosaurs. We're diving into Bajadasaurus pronuspinax. Forget the usual giants for a moment. This is an early Cretaceous sauropod found in Patagonia, Argentina. And it's not famous for its size, but for this. Well, this absolutely wild set of long forward curving spines right off its neck.
Yeah, they really are something else. When it was first described, those spines, they made news everywhere. People were fascinated.
Exactly. So today, our mission really is to unpack what the science tells us, looking at the fossil evidence, the research.
Yeah.
What's the story behind this unique creature?
Absolutely. And it's more than just, another fossil find. Bajadasaurus really presents some fascinating questions, especially with those spines. We'll look at its discovery, figure out where it fits in the family tree.
Who its relatives were.
Precisely. And tackle that big debate. Why the spines? What were they actually for?
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Where and when did this spiny character first show up?
So the story kicks off in 2010. We're in the Bajada, Colorado locality, northern Patagonia, Argentina. It's a real hot spot for finding dinosaurs.
Right.
And it was the Argentinian paleontologist Pablo Gallina who spotted it. But it wasn't, a whole skeleton lying there. It actually started with just a few teeth weathering out of the rock.
So just a hint of something bigger hidden away.
Exactly. It suggested something significant was buried deeper.
So no dramatic dusting off a perfect skeleton scene then?
No, not quite like the movies. Fossils there can be pretty delicate. So the team, very smartly, decided to excavate the whole thing in one go, as a single big block of rock.
Like a time capsule in stone.
That's a good way to put it. They wrapped it all in plaster, for protection, shipped it to the lab, and then began the slow work of preparation, carefully removing the rock bit by bit.
And eventually revealing the skull and parts of the neck?
Wow.
Where can someone see this specimen now? I want it to.
The holotype, that's the key reference specimen for the species. It's kept at the Museo Municipal Ernesto Bachmann. That's in Villa El Chocón, Neuquén Province, Argentina. It has a collection number 2, MMCH PV75.
Right. And the name, Bajadasaurus pronuspinax. Quite a mouthful, but very descriptive, I guess.
It really is. Gallina and his colleagues published the formal description back in 2019, and the name tells you a lot, Bajadasaurus. Bajada is Spanish for downhill, referring to the location.
The Bajada, Colorado locale.
Exactly. And saurus, of course, Greek for lizard, so downhill lizard.
Okay.
And the species name, pronuspinax, zeroes right in on those spines. Pronus is Latin for bent over forward, and spinax is Greek for spine.
So downhill lizard with forward bending spines. It certainly paints a picture.
It does, and it's worth mentioning our understanding of its head specifically got a big update in 2023. Juan Guarderas and his team did a detailed study using 3D reconstructions from CT scans, really fleshed out the skull details.
Good point. Okay, so the name makes sense. Now let's zoom out. The big picture. Where does Bajadasaurus sit in the grand dinosaur family tree?
Right. So it's a sauropod. That's the big group. The long necks, long tails, clan eaters.
The classic giants.
Yep. More specifically, it belongs to the Diplodocoidea superfamily. And within that, the Dicryosauridae family. Think of it like nested boxes, Sauropoda, then Diplodocoidea, then Dicryosauridae.
Dicryosauridae. Okay, that family name isn't quite as famous as, say, Diplodocidae. What makes them distinct? What are their key features?
Well, generally, Dicryosaurids were smaller than many other sauropods, still big, maybe elephant-sized, but not the true behemoths. They also tended to have relatively shorter necks.
Shorter necks, interesting.
Yeah, but a really defining feature, and this is key for Bajadasaurus, is they often have these long, bifurcated neural spines on their vertebrae.
Bifurcated meaning?
You split in two.
Exactly, like two prongs sticking up. And in Bajadasaurus and its relative Amargasaurus, these spines are just incredibly elongated, extremely long.
Oh, and another thing, the holotype specimen, the bones show fusion in the brain case and vertebrae. That tells us it was a mature adult when it died.
Okay, so those super spines are kind of a family signature, just taken to the extreme in Bajadasaurus. Now, you mentioned phylogenetic analyses. Where does it fit within the Dicryosauridae? Is its position settled?
Well, that's where it gets a bit debated still. Different studies, using slightly different methods or data sets, have placed it in slightly different spots on the family tree.
Okay.
Gallina's original 2019 paper suggested it was kind of intermediate, somewhere in the middle. But then a 2020 study by Whitlock and Wilson Mantilla suggested it might be more basal branching off earlier.
More ancient within the group.
Potentially, yes. And then Winholz and colleagues in 2022 found some results grouping it with other South American forms like Amargatitanes and Pilmatuia. So the exact relationships are still being fine-tuned.
Fascinating. Science in progress. But it's definitely a dicrasaurid. What are the clinchers, the features that lock it into that group?
There are 6 specific shared features, synapomorphies, that tie it firmly to the Dicraeosauridae. Think of them as inherited family traits in the skeleton.
Right.
But Bajadasaurus also has its own unique quirks. 4 identify autapomorphies features found only in this species.
And these include?
Okay, so there's a skull opening, the posttemporal fenestra, that extends further inwards towards the middle. The bicipterygoid processes, bony struts under the brain case, are unusually slender and long. The spine on the second neck vertebra points straight up, vertically. And of course, those super long, forward curving spines on the neck vertebrae, those are its signature features.
Right, those spines are impossible to ignore. But let's talk skull first. You said it's the most complete dicrasaurid skull known. That must be invaluable.
Absolutely. It gives us a fantastic window. Like other flagellocadatans, that's the bigger group, including dicraeosaurids and diplodocids. The skull is quite slender, elongated.
What parts were preserved?
We have the pterygoids from the roof of the mouth, most of the skull roof itself, the brain case, the lower jaws, and bits of the upper jaws. The main missing bit is the middle section, connecting the front and back.
And I imagine millions of years in the ground took a toll.
Oh, definitely. There's evidence of diagenesis, the changes fossils undergo. So the skull shows crushing, some fractures, and the brain case got a bit warped, what we call plastic deformation. But even with that, the details preserved are amazing.
So what are some of the standout features of the skull itself? Anything unusual?
One really interesting thing is the eye sockets, the orbits. You can actually see them when you look down on the skull from the top.
That's different.
Yeah, it's unusual for most related dinosaurs. Lingalong is maybe the exception. Also, the postorbital bone behind the eye has a process that usually points back, but in Bajadasaurus, it's kind of reduced, indistinct, similar to Dicraeosaurus and Amargasaurus. Then there's the squamosal bone at the back corner. It has this long process pointing down. That's unique among dicraeosaurids found so far. It might have connected to the quadratojugal bone below it.
Which is something you don't see in diplodocids.
Right, and it hadn't been seen in other dicraeosaurids, so that's potentially significant. The opening on the side, the lateral temporal fenestra, is narrow and angled. And the quadrate, part of the jaw joint, has some unique features too, an expanded lower surface. And its connection to the squamosal is long, but doesn't widen out, maybe more autapomorphies there.
In the very back of the skull, where it joins the neck.
That occipital region is pretty well preserved. The supraoccipital bone at the top is fused to the bones below it. There's a clear ridge down the middle, a sagittal neutral crest, and those post-temporal fenestrae we mentioned. They're really noticeably extended inwards. That's one of the key unique traits.
Right, the autapomorphy.
The occipital condyle, the knob connecting to the neck, it's wider than tall, and its back surface isn't wider than its neck, which differs from Amargasaurus and Dicraeosaurus. And underneath the brain case, these long, skinny rods, the bicipterygoid processes, they stick out forwards and down. They're quite gracile.
And they connect to the palate.
Exactly. The pterygoid bones, the preserved palate parts, show a smooth crest where they would have articulated with those processes.
Okay, moving down from the skull. Jaws and teeth, pencil-shaped, you said.
Yep, slender, pencil-like teeth. Slightly curved inwards, tilted forwards, and packed right at the front of the jaws. Not all along the jawline.
And the lower jaw itself. Pretty long.
Yeah, about 80% of the skull length, similar to diplodocids, actually, which maybe suggests some earlier reconstructions of dicraeosaurid jaws might have underestimated their length.
How many teeth are we talking?
Well, the left maxilla, the upper jawbone, had 8 sockets. Based on that, on the lower jaw, the estimate is around 48 teeth total, so 24 up, 24 down.
And the shape of that lower jawbone, the dentary.
It's slender. Looks more like Suos's than the deeper one in Dicraeosaurus. And unlike diplodocids, the two sides didn't form a square snout. It's more rounded, kind of a J shape. That's typical Dicraeosaurid.
A little chin.
Yeah, a sort of hook-like projection at the very front. You see that in other flagellicatatons too. And further back, the angular bone is quite long, longer than the syringular bone next to it. That's different from diplodocids.
And didn't you mention something about tooth replacement earlier?
Ah, yes. Recent work, I think Garderus estimated it for 2025, suggests a pretty quick replacement rate. Around 40.7 days per tooth.
Wow, 40 days. That's fast. Okay, now, the moment we've been waiting for. Those neck vertebrae. The spines.
Right. The specimen has the first two neck vertebrae, atlas and axis, and what's thought to be the fifth one. And interestingly, two tiny bones called proutlasses, which sit between the skull and the atlas, were found still attached to the skull.
Cool. What about the first two vertebrae themselves?
The atlas, the very first one, only the upper parts are preserved. They were triangular, kind of wing-like. The axis, the second one, is almost complete. Like in Dicraeosaurus, it was tall, twice as high as long. And its main body, the centrum, was long, twice as long as high.
Any notable features on the axis?
The little side projections, diapophyses, were small and pointed backward, like in Suwasi. But the neural spine on top, that's special. It's narrow, not split. Points straight up vertically, remember, that's unique to Bajadasaurus. And it's triangular in cross-section, tapering towards the top.
Okay. And then vertebra number 5, the showstopper.
Exactly. This is the one with that incredible neural spine. It's hugely elongated, 58 centimeters. It's almost 2 feet long, and it's deeply split into two separate rod-like elements.
Making the whole vertebra, what, 4 times taller than long?
Pretty much, yeah. It's just astonishing. Only a Margosaurus comes close in terms of spine length among sauropods.
But a Margosaurus spines curve backward.
Yeah.
And these curve forward.
Precisely. That's a key difference. Dicraeosaurus spines are much shorter, though they do lean forward a bit. And then Brachytrachelopan just had really short neck vertebrae overall. So Bajadasaurus is really out there on its own with these forward curving spears.
What were those rod-like elements actually like in structure?
Well, their bases, where they attach, were triangular and flattened side to side, but for most of their length, they were sort of egg-shaped in cross-section. And the tips weren't sharp points like in a Margosaurus. They broadened out just slightly.
And the idea of a horn sheath covering them, like on a Margosaurus.
That was suggested, yeah.
Yeah.
A Margosaurus spines have these faint lines, striations, that hint at a keratin covering, like horn. The preservation isn't quite as good on the Bajadasaurus spines, so the striations aren't clear. But Galena's team thought it was plausible they had a similar horny sheath.
Which leads us to the million-dollar question. What on earth were these things for? This has to be the biggest puzzle.
Oh, absolutely. It's the question everyone asks. The initial suggestion back in 2019 was passive defense.
Like a deterrent.
Yeah. The idea was that these forward-pointing spines, especially maybe lower down the neck, could have formed a kind of barrier, made it hard for a predator to bite the neck effectively. It echoes some of the ideas floated for a Margosaurus display, defense, maybe thermoregulation supporting a sail, or those horn sheaths.
Right. And didn't research on Dicraeosaurs show air sacs running between the split spines? How does that fit in?
Good point. Daniela Schwartz and her colleagues showed that this air sac, part of the respiratory system, likely sat in that gap between the two prongs of the spine. In Dicraeosaurus, maybe it filled the whole gap. In a Margosaurus, perhaps just the lower third, leaving the top 2/3 potentially covered in horn.
So if Bajadasaurus had horn sheaths, they could have made the spines even longer.
That was the speculation, yes. Galena and his team suggested the sheaths could have added maybe 50% or more to the length. They pointed to modern animals, like some antelope or cattle, where the horn sheath is much longer than the bony core, or even the armored dinosaur Borealopelta.
And the curve might have helped.
Possibly made them stronger, more resistant to bending or breaking. Like the curve in a bighorn sheep's horns adds resilience.
Okay, so defense is one major hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a counter-argument now, isn't there? Something about a sail.
Yes, exactly. A 2022 study by Serta and colleagues looked closely at the bone microstructure, the osteohistology of a Margosaurus, and another indeterminate Dicraeosaurid.
What did they find?
They didn't see the kind of dense outer bone layer they'd expect if it supported a thick keratin sheath. Instead, the structure suggested it might have been covered by skin, possibly forming a vascularized sail, like you see on some other reptiles or dinosaurs.
With blood vessels and maybe for display?
Potentially, yes. They also found cyclical growth marks, which might fit better with a dynamic skin structure than a static horn sheath.
Yeah.
And they proposed this interpretation could potentially apply to Bajadasaurus too, despite the different curve.
Wow. So defense spikes versus display sail. That's a huge difference in interpretation. Still very much debated then.
Very much so. It highlights how we interpret function from fossils.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. What about its senses? How did it perceive its world? And how did it eat?
Well, there's work suggesting a Margosaurus likely held its snout pointing somewhat downwards when feeding.
Like a grazer.
Possibly browsing low vegetation.
Yeah.
Now, if Bajadasaurus did the same, remember how its eye sockets were visible from the top?
Right. Unusual.
Galena's team wondered if this might have allowed it some degree of forward vision, even with its head down. Maybe even, potentially, stereoscopic vision depth perception.
Seeing in 3D while munching.
It's speculative, but an interesting possibility if the head posture and eye position lined up just right.
Any other feeding adaptations? You mentioned a possible beak.
Yes, the 2023 Garderus paper floated that idea. Beaks are keratins, so they don't usually fossilize, but they pointed to some indirect clues on the upper jawbone, the maxilla, like a sort of step on the side surface.
Which you see in beaked animals.
Sometimes, yes, a beak could potentially reduce stress on the jaws, maybe provide an extra cutting edge for plants. But they were careful to say it's just a hypothesis, needs more evidence.
And we know it had that fast tooth replacement.
Right, about 40.7 days. And fewer replacement teeth waiting in the wings compared to other diplodicoids. Along with the pencil shape, this reinforces the idea it was probably specializing in eating lower-growing vegetation, a browser.
Okay, finally, let's place Bajadasaurus in its world. What was early Cretaceous Patagonia like back then?
We're talking late Berriasian to Valanginian stages, roughly 145 to 133 million years ago. The fossils come from the Bajada Colorado Formation.
And what kind of environment does that formation represent?
Primarily river systems. Lots of sandstones, conglomerates, some finer clay stones and siltstones. Evidence of braided rivers flowing through the landscape. We also find paleosols, which are ancient soils, indicating periods when the land surface was stable.
And it wasn't alone out there.
Oh, definitely not. It was a diverse ecosystem. From the same formation, same area, we have other sauropods like Langkupal and the early Titanosaur ninjaton, plus various theropods, meat-eaters.
What kind of theropods?
A mix. Some early titanurans, maybe ebolosaurids, possibly some Deinonychosaurians, the group that includes raptors. There are tracks named Barossopus, another theropod, Elengasum, and remains possibly from Bicentenaria and Cathartosaura. Even finds attributed to tiny Ligobueno and maybe Velocisaurus. Plus, indeterminate ornithopods and a turtle, Prochilidella. It was a busy place.
So putting it all together, Bajadasaurus, a relatively small, short-necked sauropod living maybe 140 million years ago in Patagonia.
Dominated by river systems.
Right, and sporting these absolutely unique, long, forward-curving neck spines. Function, still debated defense, display sail, something else.
It had a slender head, maybe with forward-looking eyes when feeding low, possibly even a beak.
And around 48 pencil-like teeth replaced every 40 days or so for browsing plants.
Sharing its world with a whole host of other dinosaurs, big and small, plant eaters and predators.
It's fascinating how one fossil, especially one with such a striking feature, can spark so much ongoing research and debate. Those spines really capture the imagination.
They absolutely do. From the initial headlines to the detailed studies on bone structure and biomechanics, it shows the scientific process in action. We've had those aha moments, like the eye position, the tooth replacement rate, and the twists, like the sail versus sheath debate.
And it definitely leaves you thinking, if it wasn't just defense or display, what else could those spines be for? Maybe communication within the species. And how did that specific Patagonian environment drive the evolution of something so extreme? It really makes you want to learn more about dicraeosaurids and the whole lost world of Cretaceous Patagonia.
Absolutely. There's always more to uncover. Thanks for exploring it with us on this deep dive.